Alright, me. It is now the next day. It is May 5th. Or not May 5th, it's the it is May 21st. And while substituting today, I finished reading The Color Purple by Alice Walker. I believe this book won the Pulitzer Prize, if I'm not mistaken, but published in 1982. This is the second time I've read it. Both of the times I read it in basically one sitting. The first time was in the previous apartments. That would have been 2021, right after I got back from camp was when I first read it. And then now. So, The Color Purple is deeply fascinating. For one of the reasons is that it's written in what is one of my personal favorite ways of writing a book, which is, what is it, epistolography? I don't remember the technical name for it, but it is a book written in letters, right? Which is something that I think it's deeply intimate in the way that we then get to view how our characters are viewing themselves and also each other, right? Because when we're looking from even from a first person or even a third person perspective, right, we are getting their actions and what they're saying and everything, but in a letter, it is something that person then has to then perform as well, right? So not only are we getting what they've said and what they've done, we then also get this second act, which is that it's memorable enough to this person that it means something for them to write it down, right? So that's that. The other thing that's really interesting is that throughout The Color Purple, which details Celie's life, right, for the most part, and they don't give an exact time frame as to when this book is occurring, but through references to war, we're looking at probably World War II was when this ends. So they're being born in 1910-ish, probably. But one of the interesting things that's happening, right, is that as Celie is learning to, or figuring out how to enjoy her life, we see that her letters become longer and longer and longer and more verbose, right? The first 50 pages are all one single letter at a time, right? Versus once we get to the end, in which the letters both from Nettie, who is Celie's sister, and Celie both become these really long descriptions of life and what's happening around them. And it's because they've gone and they've switched from this survival mode that they're initially into actually having something to say about life, right, other than their own survival, right? Because we follow Celie, who is a deeply tragic character, right? That she is the oldest of a group of children, born to a mother that is quickly going insane, I should say, because she lost her original husband, right? And so she ends up marrying this other man, who then who has this very strong sexual desire, and when the mother cannot satisfy him at that point, he then goes after Celie, who is the oldest of the daughters, right? And Celie is then caught in this horrible world, right, of where she has everything taken away from her because the actions of an adult, someone that she should have trusted, right? As described right? Is that Celie gets pulled from school, and when Nettie and some other people tried to eventually convince the teacher to come to the house to try and get Celie back into school, the school teacher sees that Celie is pregnant and leaves it at that, right? Because at that point, nothing can be done, right? And so Celie leads this incredibly difficult life, right? Where all of her opportunities have been taken away because she's trying to protect her younger sister, Nettie. And then the same exact thing happens when marrying Mr. Blank, right? Who we later learn his name is Albert. But throughout all of this, Celie is then forced to then protect Nettie again, and is forced into this marriage with Albert. And Albert just wants a body for sex. That's really all he wants. He doesn't want it. And then he wants, I guess Albert doesn't want to do anything, right? He just wants to smoke and have sex. Whereas Celie, who is 20 at this point, must now take care of 4 kids that are not hers, even though that she's had to give up 2 of her own kids. Because they were forcibly removed from her by her stepfather. And then has to run this entire farm by herself effectively, right? And one of the things that comes out of that, right, is this expectation of gender roles in gender society, right? Of where it is the women that are expected to do all this work, and the men are just expected to be able to do whatever they want, right? Which is inherently not fair. What we see later on is when Nettie goes to Africa on a missionary trip, is that this seems to be some sort of holdover from the people that they've come from, or the what's the best way to phrase this, from the traditional roles expected in African tribes, right? In which only the men were allowed to be educated, but then also only the men didn't have to work, right? Men were given the land and the power, but then women had to do all of the actual work. And it feeds into this idea that, like, every man is a king, right? It's a very common phrase, and is just directed at how women should be treating men, especially their significant others, which is simply just not the case, right? That shouldn't be the way it's done, right? Because that's how we get man children, right? Or fathers who have no idea how to take care of their own kids, and things like that, right? But that is the traditional expectation that has been then forced upon Celie in this marriage. And then Celie then tries to force it onto Sophia, right, who ends up marrying the oldest of Celie's adopted children, and that's a whole ordeal, right? And then this kind of cycle continues on and on and on and on, right? But in reality, that's not the main point of this, I don't think, right? I would argue, right, citing back to the way that the letters kind of extend as we get older, and then the last kind of few lines in this book, really the main point of this is an attempt to appreciate and to love in a world that does not always love you, right? One of the consistent things that we see, especially with the women throughout all of this book, is that they try their best to be loved, even if the actions that they receive from the men around them do not equate that, right? The women are forced into submission in many ways, right? Or at least attempted to be forced. And it's a struggle of how do we show our love when this is how we are treated by the world, right? Yeah, because one of the things that we see, right, is that Seely eventually falls in love with Shug, also known as Avery, who is from the same area, has become a very popular singer, and Shug loves her back in the way that she can, right? And it's at this point that suddenly the letters become more verbose from Seely. And one of the things that we kind of point at is that, like, this is when Seely discovers really the color purple and really thinks about the color purple in her own way. But then also it comes to this head point of, like, as Shug describes it, the way that we appreciate and love God is not by being fearful to him and obeying everything to the letter of the Bible, right? It is by appreciating and enjoying the world around us, right? A world that God has created for us. And if we refuse to enjoy that and celebrate that, then why has it been created in the first place, right? And that's really the point in which Seely changes, right? Seely goes from being this person who's fearful of everything and has effectively shut herself in, to being someone who has become very outspoken in a lot of ways and is willing to fight for what she believes in and what she wants, because she is not forced to reconcile with, she needs to find a way to enjoy this life rather than wait for the next one, right? She cannot stand idle at this point and just accept the world. She must fight for what she wants, right? And fight to be heard. And it's at this point, right, of where, as is later described, when Shug eventually goes and starts being with, can't remember his name, but the younger boy, and Seely moves back to the original house, is that we get this thing in which Seely recognizes that if Shug comes back, she'll be happy, but if Shug never comes back, she'll still be content, right? And it's because she's allowed herself this grace to be able to live in a world and accept the world around her that doesn't always love her in the same way back, right? It's also, I think, a very, very outspoken thing of the importance of allowing people to navigate their own relationships, instead of forcing relationships upon them, right? And it's a thing that we still struggle with to this day, right? Of where, like, what I talked about with Emma for a little bit is, I talked about with Jane Austen's Emma for a little bit, is that, right, we love to play the role of matchmaker because it makes us feel important in other people's lives. But also what that ends up doing a lot of times is we force these relationships and then they end up not working, and then there are unforeseen consequences for those relationships and the breaking of those. And so, right, it's a constant fight that Seely has to continuously go through, of where she has all these relationships, but now that she has decided to follow in this new form of thinking in which she has to enjoy the life and enjoy the world around her in order to make sense of it, well, now she has to reevaluate and reconsider all these relationships, right? Whether it be a relationship with Shug, her relationship with Albert, her relationship with, you know, the children that she has raised, even though they're not hers. And eventually comes to the point where she reconsiders her relationship with her stepfather. Because as we learn later on, near the very, very end of the story, is that Celie and Nettie have believed their entire lives that this man was their actual father, right? And it was an act of incest, an act of vulgarity, that has led to this, right? And led to the treatment of Celie. And then at the very end, we learn that what has happened is that Celie's father was very suddenly killed, and then Celie's mother went insane for the most part. This new person came in, married Celie, but married Celie's mother, and the mother already at that point already had her 2 kids, and then eventually, right, everything transpired, right, which I want to make it very clear does not excuse any of the actions that the stepfather took, right, and it certainly does not excuse the fact that everyone else around him congratulated him because he raised 2 kids that were not his, and because he, you know, he donated a whole bunch of money to a whole bunch of things and whatnot, so then he made a lot of money, right? It does not excuse those things. In Celie's mind, however, it lessens things a little bit, because it's no longer, right, this one further step of incest. She still hates him, rightfully so, right? But it certainly changes her viewpoint on herself in a lot of ways. But yeah. And that's The Color Purple by Alice Walker. A very, very good read. Do highly recommend it if you never read the book, but that's that.